Hi there, and welcome to my session on solving real world market problems for product managers. So, I'm going to talk to you about ways you can size and define a market on a very low budget. Second, we'll talk about how to tell the difference between a feature and solution. And third, how do you know when your market is saturating? So, first concept I want to let you know about is that really when you're looking at business information, there are two different types or categories of information. One is the stuff that if you're doing a startup, the VCs will ask you for. And that's where you're looking to demonstrate that a market is really big and, frankly, that you know how to do your homework. The second type of information is decision making insights that you use within a company to make day to day tactical decisions about what you're doing. In those cases, you do not want to call on the really large kind of showmanship numbers. You want to be sure that you're getting stuff that is as accurate as possible that will let you make really well informed decisions. That's the type of information I'm going to be talking about today, is that latter sort. So there's a lot of conventional wisdom about information that you can use for decision making in companies. One is the idea that market research surveys are the king. You know that quantitative data, preferably with thousands of respondents, is the best thing that you can possibly get. And indeed, it is very, very useful. But you can't use quant surveys to answer a lot of really critical questions. Second, you can get third party reports. You can always buy those things. I get solicitations for them all the time with estimates of market sizes and things like that. And the big thing to understand is if those things are available for a couple $1,000s, which they usually are, chances are that there isn't a lot of research behind them, that instead they're just kind of stuff that was fabricated by somebody using information that they got off the web. You'll also hear a lot about social listening. So that's the practice of collecting feedback on places like Twitter and Facebook in order to tell you what customers are saying. That is incredibly dangerous because those things are all self-selected. I get a lot of product managers who tell me they can just iterate their way to success. That's great if you have infinite money, like your Google. But other than that, you do much better if you can form some good hypotheses before you start iterating so that you have a chance of getting to a successful product quickly. Because for most of us, you can't just iterate around forever. You need to do it as quickly as you can. Finally, there are a lot of people who feel like analytics can tell them everything that they need to know. Analytics are actually great for telling you what customers are doing, but they won't tell you why. And you really need to understand the why if you're going to make good decisions. So let me dig into some of this stuff in more detail. So first of all, quantitative surveys. Hey, SurveyMonkey is wonderful. Qualtrics is wonderful. I use them. We have subscriptions to them, but there are some limitations on their stuff. First is if you're doing a B2B business, or even if you're doing B2C, but you're after a narrow vertical, it is very difficult and very expensive to get a good quantitative sample in the sizes that will let you have statistical significance. In a lot of cases, you'll be tempted to go for volunteer respondents or maybe social media to recruit your participants. But if you do that, again, those are volunteer things where they're self selected. They won't be typical of normal customers, and so they may lead you astray. Surveys also can't tell you why people come up with answers, and often it's the why that's the most illuminating. You always want to know if you're doing a survey, always include a comment field in all the questions so that you can get some feedback. But even there, you're not going to get the full richness that you need for decision making. Surveys also give you a big problem around regression to the mean. So you do want to do surveys, but you want to understand exactly what decisions you're trying to make. And you will do best if you do interviews first to understand the different ranges of things that people might want. And then you use the survey just to quantify those segments of the market. Good sources of information, the ones I use the most, are first of all the major polling firms. From time to time, they do free surveys that you can get access to. There are also nonprofits that publish everything that they do. Pew Research is a great source for this stuff. The US Business Census can also be really, really useful. They've got all this data on the size of different vertical markets and company sizes and revenue, and you can cut it in all sorts of different ways to get estimates of market sizes. I also heavily use interviews with customers to ground me in what the customer reality is. And very often, if you cross check between these different sources and you look at different angles on the problem you're trying to solve, this is the best way to get really good information. So that means interviews are absolutely critical to making this stuff all work. Things to understand about interviews. Number one, you may well have to pay for people's times, especially if you're asking business decision makers like a CMO or a VP of product or something like that. Even to get half an hour of their time, you usually will have to offer them between $3 and maybe even $500. LinkedIn is great for recruiting these people because you can look at their backgrounds and their job titles. It's really good sometimes to look for people who've just left a role and who are either doing a search or maybe they're consulting now because they have more time available to talk to you. Even if you find those people who are willing to talk, you've got to be really clear when you reach out to them that this is not a covert sales pitch and that you're not going to use any quotes from them in marketing because that's what they're always afraid of. You want to be really clear this is just for your decision making. You may have to ask 100 people in order to get 10 interviews. The hit rate can be really low. In fact, if you get 10 out of 100, you're doing really, really well. So you're going to have to devote time to this. When you do the interviews, record these things and take notes on what you're doing. Those recordings are something that you will use later to either show your investors how people react to your ideas, or to show other people in the company who you need to convince and persuade and keep focused. So make sure you get video recordings like the recording you're watching here. How many interviews do you need to do? Well, I usually say 5 is a minimum, but really what you want to do is keep doing interviews until the responses start to repeat each other. Tips on doing the interviews. Get people talking about themselves. They love talking about themselves. Invite them to guide the conversation. Say, look, I'm looking to learn from you. I've got some questions, but I really want you to feel free to guide it toward the stuff that you feel I need to know. You'd be surprised how often they'll volunteer information when you do that. Ask questions that will help you get inside their head. What you're trying to do is understand how do they think and what their problems are. And once you get that really well, you can make a lot of decisions on their basis because you understand how they think. So you do not start off talking to them about your product. Talk to them about their problems. What are your goals? Where do you get stuck? What keeps you up at night? Then what you do is you introduce what you're looking at and get their reactions. And you want to see if you get a strong positive reaction. If they just say, well, yeah, I could see myself potentially using that, what that's actually telling you is that they're just being polite and you need to keep working on it. Next, let's talk about features versus solutions and how to think about those things. So, a feature is a characteristic of something. So, for instance, if you do a word processor, the ability to make bold text is a feature. A solution is something that solves a problem for a person. So, for instance, an entire word processing program is a solution. The ability to make bold text is a feature that's in that solution. So, how do you tell if something's a solution? Well, first thing you want to do is ask, what's the problem that I'm solving? And it has to be a problem of the customer, not a problem of you. So, I talk to a lot of PMs all the time, and I got this constantly when I was consulting, who would say, well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to generate stickiness. We want to generate recurring revenue. And that's what the thing that we're building is all about. Generating recurrent revenue is not your customer's problem. That's your problem. What the customer needs to do is solve some difficulty that they have. And so you got to identify what that difficulty is. And then you got to make sure the customer cares about it. How often do they encounter it? How painful is the problem? Do they have easy workarounds? Have they found ways to live with it? How important is it relative to their other problems? If they got a problem, but there are 15 other things that are more important to them, they're not going to be interested in buying from you. And then how easily can you persuade them to care? Answering all those questions is where the interviews are really, really ideal. And what you're trying to do is trying to find aspirin problems, things that actually cause active pain to people. Now let's talk about market saturation. So, if you've ever gone to business school or you've read business books, you've undoubtedly seen this adoption curve. And there's a whole book about it. Well, actually, there are a ton of books about it, but there's one that's really famous called Crossing the Chasm. And so, this chart should be very familiar to you. And I want you to understand that it is an incredibly dangerous chart because it can lead you to make a lot of really, really bad business assumptions. So the first thing to understand about that adoption curve is that it only works retroactively. If you are in the process of trying to build a market, it is very, very, very difficult to tell the difference between curve A and curve B. In other words, one that's about to stop growing versus one that still has enormous growth. Now, you could say, well, I'm going to find out because I'm going to talk to the customers that we get here, and I'll find out if they're early adopter types or if they're later adopter types, and that'll tell me where they are. Um, that doesn't actually work because people who are early adopters for one thing are late adopters for another thing. If you're doing a new product category or a new product, you won't know who the early adopters are in your space, and therefore you won't know how many early adopters there are, and therefore you can't figure out what your position is on that curve. You don't know how big the market is until it's already stopped growing, in which case it's too late to adjust for things. That saturation point, that point when growth stops, can happen really, really quickly. So this is what you think the market's going to behave like. I'm going to get gradual growth and it's going to go up and then it'll gradually slow down and then I'll be able to navigate down here. And around here I can start working on my next markets and stuff like that. This is not how the sales curve actually looks. It looks instead more like this. It's really slow to get traction initially because your company is small and people don't know what your product is and they haven't heard of it. So you'll bumble along really flat for a long, long time. So then eventually you start to get some more traction and things pick up. And what do? You hire some salespeople because you've made the product really well because you spent your time in purgatory down here. You hire some salespeople and sales start to really pick up. So you hire more salespeople and that's going great. Let's hire a bunch more. Hey, let's really, really ramp it up. This is going great. And your sales projection is going to look like this. But what's happening is you're not still in the early adopters because you've hired a lot more salespeople, because you did your homework back here. You're actually chewing through all of the late adopters in a very short period of time because you've increased your resources so much. So you can actually be here at the very end of adoption when the entire market is about to saturate, but you'll be here in terms of your sales growth. So all of a sudden things flatten off and maybe they go up and down as you mess around with pricing or something like that. But you're actually in a situation where sales are about to drop quite a bit. And what will happen at this point is the company will panic. You'll get fired probably. Eventually the business will stabilize down here somewhere and, replacement sales and stuff like that. It'll stabilize and there'll be a sustainable business. But you won't get to stick around for that to happen. You're going to be looking for your next job. So you need to understand where this inflection point is way before it happens so you can invest in the new stuff you need to do over here. So the other thing to understand about the adoption curves is that they move up and down in reality. The other thing about this, aside from the wiggliness of the numbers, is that this is done by retroactively on industries that ended up reaching the entire country. Most products are over here, and you can't tell whether you're in this category or this category until after the fact. So you have to be really, really sensitive to tiny clues that will tell you what's going on. Here's what you need to do. You have to develop constructive, intentional paranoia about your marketplace. And you've got to be really sensitive about the small warning signs that can tell you that you're actually getting towards saturation. The things to watch out for are subtle declines in the growth rate. If it starts to get a little, maybe you were getting 100% year over year growth previously, and now you're getting 80 or 70, that's a bad sign. You should be looking into that. If you start to get drops in the efficiency of your conversion, you have to do more work to get the same number of customers. That's a really bad sign. If you're starting to get pressures on your margins, like you have to drop prices a little bit in order to maintain the same level of growth, that is a definite sign that you're approaching either a ton more competition or that you're getting starting to saturate. What you've got to do when you see those problems is start working right then on the things that you need to do in order to solve those problems. It may be opening up a new segment in your market. It may be working on the next big product that's going to drive your growth. Whatever it is, you got to shake a stick and really get after that as quickly as you can. Once you lose momentum, it is very hard to reestablish it for a business. It is much harder to recreate growth after you've lost it than it is to just keep that growth moving in the first place. And the way you do that is being by really, really paranoid about those potential problems as soon as you start to see them.